Imagine waking up in a medieval world where the very idea of privacy simply does not exist. Not as a right, not as a desire, and barely even as a concept. And within hours, you would realize why a modern person would struggle to last even a single day. Your morning would begin, not in a private bedroom, but in a shared space, often a single-room dwelling where parents, children, servants, and sometimes animals all slept together, breathed together, and woke together. Every movement you made would be observed, commented on, and remembered, because walls were thin, doors were rare, and silence itself was suspicious. Getting dressed would not be a personal ritual, but a public act, performed in front of others, with no expectation of modesty, as we understand it. Because bodies were simply bodies, and shame was reserved for moral failure, rather than exposure. Even bodily functions offered no sanctuary. Communal latrines were common, often nothing more than holes overflowing pits, used side by side with strangers, while chamber pots were emptied into streets under the watchful eyes of neighbours. Bathing, when it happened at all, was frequently communal, and rumours, judgments, and gossip flowed as freely as the water. Your thoughts would not be safe either, because medieval life was deeply communal and intensely moral, meaning your beliefs, prayers, fears, and doubts were constantly scrutinized by family, clergy, and community members, who believed it was their duty to correct, guide, or report you. Confession was mandatory, and spiritual privacy was non-existent. Your sins were catalogued, judged, and sometimes punished publicly to reinforce social order. Work provided no escape, as most labour was done collectively in fields, workshops, or guild halls, where conversation, observation, and hierarchy were constant. A mistake was never just yours. It was witnessed, discussed, and remembered, sometimes for years, shaping your reputation in a society where reputation was survival. Even meals were rarely private, eaten at long shared tables where seating reflected status and every bite could be noticed, questioned, or mocked. Marriage offered no refuge either, because marital intimacy was often regulated by religious doctrine and community expectation, with neighbours keenly aware of who slept with whom, how often, and whether children followed. Noise was omnipresent, from church bells dictating daily life to market cries, animals, arguments, and sermons, leaving no mental quiet, no retreat into solitude. Letters, if you could write them, were often dictated to scribes and read aloud, stripping communication of secrecy. Illness, grief, and death were also public affairs. The sick were tended in shared spaces, mourners gathered openly, and the dying were rarely alone, surrounded by family and clergy ensuring a proper end. Justice itself was public and performative, with punishments carried out in town squares as both spectacle and warning, reminding everyone that the community always watched. Your modern instinct to withdraw, to lock a door, to be alone with your thoughts, to control who sees your body or hears your words, would be met with confusion or suspicion, because privacy implied secrecy, and secrecy implied guilt. The medieval world survived on mutual surveillance, where everyone knew everyone else's business, not out of cruelty alone, but necessity. As survival depended on shared labour, shared resources, and shared morality. By nightfall, exhausted not just physically but mentally, you would realize that the constant exposure, the unbroken presence of others, and the absence of any personal boundary would feel suffocating, even frightening, to a modern mind shaped by individualism. You would not fail because medieval people were weaker or harsher. but because they lived by a completely different social logic, one where the self was never separate from the group, and the idea of being alone, unseen and unjudged, for even a moment was not a luxury denied, but a concept never imagined, making it painfully clear why you wouldn't last a single day without privacy in medieval times. By the second imagined day, the weight of constant observation would begin to feel unbearable, because medieval society did not merely lack privacy in physical space, it erased privacy of identity itself. You would quickly learn that your name, family, profession, and moral standing defined you entirely, leaving no room to reinvent yourself or retreat from past mistakes. Every action became a performance, not for an abstract audience, but for the same faces you would see every day for the rest of your life. If you argued with someone in the morning, that tension followed you to the market, the church, the fields, and the evening meal, because there was no place to cool off alone, no private room to calm your thoughts, no anonymous crowd to disappear into. Even sleep offered no true escape, as snores, coughs, whispers, and the restless shifting of others surrounded you, reminding you that solitude was a fantasy. Dreams, fears, and anxieties were often interpreted communally as omens or moral warnings, meaning even your subconscious life could become a topic of discussion. Children grew up under the same gaze, disciplined not behind closed doors, but openly, learning early that behavior was everyone's concern. Love and desire were never private emotions. Glances, gestures, and rumors were enough to ignite suspicion, and reputations could be destroyed by nothing more than whispered speculation. A single accusation, even without proof, could cling to you permanently, because memory was collective and forgiveness was rare. The Church reinforced this exposure by teaching that God saw everything, making the absence of privacy not only social but cosmic. To be alone was to invite temptation, danger, or heresy, so constant togetherness was framed as protection rather than intrusion. Even travel offered little relief, as inns packed strangers into shared rooms and communal beds, where you slept inches away from unknown bodies, sharing warmth, smells, and unspoken fears. Silence itself was distrusted. A quiet person was assumed to be hiding something, planning something, or harboring sin. Laughter, anger, grief, and joy were all expected to be visible, regulated, and appropriate to your station, leaving no room for emotional privacy. If you were poor, your poverty was on display daily. If you were wealthy, your privilege was equally visible and constantly judged. Clothing, posture, and speech were read like public documents, signaling your place in the hierarchy and inviting correction if you stepped out of line. Punishment for deviance was rarely subtle, because shame was a tool, and public humiliation was considered an effective way to maintain order. Stocks, pillories, and public penance existed not just to punish, but to erase any illusion that one could suffer privately. Even charity came without anonymity, as receiving help marked you publicly as needy, dependent, and lesser. For a modern mind accustomed to curating identity online while guarding inner life fiercely, this relentless exposure would feel like a slow psychological suffocation. You would crave a locked door, a quiet room, a moment where no one expected anything from you, but such desires would be unintelligible to those around you. They would see your discomfort not as exhaustion, but as arrogance or weakness, proof that you were unwilling to submit to the shared rhythm of life. By the end of that day, you would understand that medieval people did not endure this lack of privacy. Reluctantly, They were shaped by it, supported by it, and disciplined through it. What breaks the modern individual is not dirt, danger, or disease alone, but the realization that without privacy, there is no safe inner space to retreat to, no invisible boundary between self and world, and without that boundary, the self itself begins to dissolve, making it clear once again why you would not last even a single day without privacy in medieval times. And if you somehow endured longer, the slow damage would become clearer in ways that are harder to notice at first, but far more destructive. The constant lack of privacy would begin to reshape how you think, until your own inner voice felt less like a refuge and more like another audience judging you. You would start censoring thoughts before they fully formed, anticipating how they might sound if spoken aloud, because in a world where everything leaks, even imagination feels unsafe. There would be no private failures, no quiet moments to be bad at something before improving. No space to fall apart and reassemble yourself unseen. Every attempt to change, grow, or question would happen under observation, turning self-discovery into risk. You would realize that medieval society survived by limiting inner conflict, discouraging introspection, and rewarding obedience, because a person who thinks too much alone becomes unpredictable. Loneliness, as we understand it, would be impossible, but so would solitude. And without solitude, emotional clarity would never arrive. Anger would simmer without release. Sadness would linger without processing, and anxiety would spread because there was no safe place to contain it. Even hope would feel dangerous, because dreams spoken aloud invited ridicule or suspicion, while dreams kept silent created tension inside a culture hostile to secrecy. Over time, you would feel a strange erosion of personal responsibility, as decisions were always shared, guided, or enforced, making it easier to surrender agency entirely. This is how medieval life maintained stability, by dissolving the individual into the collective so thoroughly that privacy was unnecessary. But for someone shaped by modern expectations of personal space and inner freedom, this dissolution would feel like suffocation of the soul. You would miss not comfort, but invisibility. And even sealed into that finished shape, you would sense a faint resistance inside yourself. Not strong enough to rebel, but strong enough to feel vaguely uncomfortable, like a muscle held tense for too long without release. You would move through your days efficiently, predictably, and correctly, yet carry an underlying fatigue that no amount of rest seems to touch. This fatigue would not come from labor or hardship alone, but from the constant necessity of being legible, of making sense to others at every moment. Without privacy, you are never allowed to be incoherent, never permitted to not know what you feel or why you feel it. Confusion must be resolved quickly, doubt smoothed over, hesitation explained away. Over time, this pressure would teach you to preemptively simplify yourself, to present a version of your inner world that is easily understood, even if it is incomplete. You would begin to live ahead of yourself, anticipating how you must appear rather than discovering how you actually are. That anticipation would quietly replace curiosity, because curiosity risks delay, and delay invites scrutiny. The inner life would become narrow, not because it is forbidden outright, but because it is never rewarded. Nothing in the environment encourages slow thought, private wondering, or silent reconsideration. Instead, you would be praised for steadiness, reliability, and consistency, traits that thrive in visibility, but slowly starve the inner self. You would notice that your reactions grow quicker and shallower, because depth takes time alone to form. Even when something moves you, the feeling would pass before it can root itself, leaving no lasting imprint. Life would feel full of events, yet strangely empty of accumulation, as though nothing ever truly stays with you. Without privacy, there is no internal archive, no private record where experiences are stored, revisited and woven into identity. Everything happens is shared, and then disappears into routine. You would begin to feel as though you are always starting again, yet never beginning anything new. This endless present would feel stable but suffocating, offering continuity without evolution. And in that state, the modern instinct to withdraw, to be unseen, to sit with yourself without explanation, would feel less like a desire and more like a forgotten language. You would no longer know how to access it, even if it were suddenly offered. That loss of access is the deepest consequence of living without privacy. Not just that you cannot be alone, but that you forget how aloneness once sustained you. At that point, the modern self does not merely struggle in a medieval world. It becomes incompatible with it, not through failure, but through gradual adaptation that leaves nothing inward left to adapt. And once that incompatibility fully settles, you would notice that even the idea of an inner boundary feels strange, almost indulgent, like a habit from another lifetime. The constant closeness of others would have trained you to feel that distance is unnatural, that separation signals danger or rejection rather than rest. You would feel uneasy when attention drifts away from you, not because you crave approval, but because being unseen has come to feel like non-existence. In a world without privacy, visibility becomes proof of life. You would measure your days not by what you discovered or understood, but by how smoothly you fit into the shared rhythm. The absence of friction would be mistaken for harmony, and harmony would be mistaken for fulfillment. Yet beneath that smoothness, there would remain a subtle instability, because a self that never withdraws has no anchor. You would drift between roles without ever fully inhabiting any of them, adapting endlessly without arriving anywhere internally. Even rest would feel performative, something done visibly, briefly, and correctly, rather than deeply and privately. Sleep would refresh the body but not the mind, because the mind would never fully disengage from awareness of others. You would dream less vividly, think less freely, and remember less personally, because those processes depend on unguarded inner space. Over time, you would begin to feel as though your life is happening in front of you, rather than within you, like a play you attend every day, but never leave with. The sense of authorship would fade entirely. You would no longer feel that your life belongs to you in any meaningful way, only that you are responsible for maintaining it. That responsibility would feel heavy but unquestioned, because questioning requires privacy, and privacy is unavailable. The world would continue to function, and you would continue to function within it. Yet something essential would remain unresolved, an absence so normalized that it no longer feels like loss, only like reality. And that normalization is what makes the idea of lasting without privacy so deceptive. You might endure indefinitely, adapt perfectly, and even appear content. But endurance is not the same as living inwardly. A modern person depends on privacy not just to hide, but to integrate, to make sense of experience, to grow quietly before stepping forward changed. Without that space, life becomes a loop rather than a path, repetition rather than progression, and in that loop, the modern self does not shatter or collapse. It simply thins until it is no longer recognizable. leaving behind a presence that survives, participates, and belongs, but never truly lives from the inside out. And even as that thinning reaches its quiet conclusion, there would still be one last unsettling layer to confront: the realization that you are no longer aware of what you are missing, only that something feels perpetually out of reach. The absence of privacy would have erased not just the inner room itself, but the memory of ever having one. You would move through life without longing for solitude, not because you are fulfilled, but because longing requires comparison, and comparison requires memory. Without a remembered contrast, the lack becomes invisible. You would feel complete in the way a sealed vessel feels complete, holding exactly what it was designed to hold and nothing more. Conversations would flow easily, routines would feel grounding, and shared rituals would provide comfort. Yet none of it would touch anything deep inside you, because depth has nowhere to collect. You would notice that your inner silence is no longer peaceful but vacant, an emptiness mistaken for calm. Thoughts would arise only when prompted, emotions only when required, reflection only when it serves a function. The inner life would operate on demand rather than curiosity. Even moments of crisis would feel strangely external, managed collectively and resolved publicly, leaving little residue behind. You would endure hardship without processing it, joy without savoring it, loss without integrating it, because integration requires time alone with feeling. Over time, life would begin to feel interchangeable, as though one day could be swapped for another, without much difference. Without privacy, uniqueness fades not just between people, but within yourself. You would feel less like a singular consciousness moving through time, and more like a node, in a continuous flow, replaceable, functional, and stable. That stability would be praised as virtue, as faithfulness, as strength, and in many ways it would be. But it would come at the cost of inner authorship. You would not feel that your life is wrong, only that it is closed, finished before it fully opens. The modern impulse to disappear for a while, to sit quietly and ask who you are becoming, would feel incomprehensible, even frightening, like stepping outside the world itself. And in that fear, you would see the final truth clearly. Privacy is not about isolation, secrecy, or selfishness. It is about giving the self a place to exist when no one else is asking anything of it. Remove that place, and the self survives only as function, not as experience. The medieval world could sustain that trade because it never promised inward fulfillment. The modern mind, however, is built around it, and so, even if you lived long, worked hard, and belonged fully, you would never truly last, because the quiet inner continuity that makes a life feel lived would have nowhere left to breathe. And beyond that final realization, life would continue in a way that feels strangely smooth, almost too smooth, like a river that no longer meets any resistance. You would flow where you are directed, carried by customs, routines, and expectations that require no inner agreement to function. Without privacy, friction disappears, and with it disappears the pressure that once shaped identity. You would stop bumping into yourself, stop encountering moments that force reflection or re-evaluation, because those encounters require stillness and distance. Instead, you would glide from task to task, interaction to interaction, feeling competent but increasingly hollow. The idea of retreating inward would feel not only unfamiliar but unnecessary, as if inner life were an outdated tool no longer suited to the world you inhabit. You would measure a good day by how little disturbance it caused, how few questions it raised, how seamlessly it fit into the collective rhythm. Disturbance would feel dangerous, not because it harms you directly, but because it interrupts the shared flow that keeps everything predictable. Over time, predictability would feel like peace. You would begin to associate comfort with sameness and stability with silence of dissent. In such a state, the mind becomes conservative by necessity, protecting order rather than seeking truth. You would still think, but your thinking would orbit around maintenance rather than meaning. Even when something inside you stirs faintly, a flicker of curiosity, a trace of dissatisfaction, it would dissolve quickly. And even sealed into that finished shape, you would sense a faint resistance inside yourself. Not strong enough to rebel, but strong enough to feel vaguely uncomfortable, like a muscle held tense for too long without release. You would move through your days efficiently, predictably, and correctly, yet carry an underlying fatigue that no amount of rest seems to touch. This fatigue would not come from labor or hardship alone, but from the constant necessity of being legible, of making sense to others at every moment. Without privacy, you are never allowed to be incoherent, never permitted to not know what you feel or why you feel it. Confusion must be resolved quickly, doubt smoothed over, hesitation explained away. Over time, this pressure would teach you to preemptively simplify yourself, to present a version of your inner world that is easily understood, even if it is incomplete. You would begin to live ahead of yourself, anticipating how you must appear rather than discovering how you actually are. That anticipation would quietly replace curiosity, because curiosity risks delay, and delay invites scrutiny. The inner life would become narrow, not because it is forbidden outright, but because it is never rewarded. Nothing in the environment encourages slow thought, private wondering, or silent reconsideration. Instead, you would be praised for steadiness, reliability, and consistency, traits that thrive in visibility, but slowly starve the inner self. You would notice that your reactions grow quicker and shallower, because depth takes time alone to form. Even when something moves you, the feeling would pass before it can root itself, leaving no lasting imprint. Life would feel full of events, yet strangely empty of accumulation, as though nothing ever truly stays with you. Without privacy, there is no internal archive, no private record where experiences are stored, revisited, and woven into identity. Everything happens is shared, and then disappears into routine. You would begin to feel as though you are always starting again, yet never beginning anything new. This endless present would feel stable but suffocating, offering continuity without evolution. And in that state, the modern instinct to withdraw, to be unseen, to sit with yourself without explanation, would feel less like a desire and more like a forgotten language. You would no longer know how to access it, even if it were suddenly offered. That loss of access is the deepest consequence of living without privacy. Not just that you cannot be alone, but that you forget how aloneness once sustained you. At that point, the modern self does not merely struggle in a medieval world. It becomes incompatible with it, not through failure, but through gradual adaptation that leaves nothing inward left to adapt. And once that incompatibility fully settles, you would notice that even the idea of an inner boundary feels strange, almost indulgent, like a habit from another lifetime. The constant closeness of others would have trained you to feel that distance is unnatural, that separation signals danger or rejection rather than rest. You would feel uneasy when attention drifts away from you, not because you crave approval, but because being unseen has come to feel like non-existence. In a world without privacy, visibility becomes proof of life. You would measure your days not by what you discovered or understood, but by how smoothly you fit into the shared rhythm. The absence of friction would be mistaken for harmony, and harmony would be mistaken for fulfillment. Yet beneath that smoothness, there would remain a subtle instability, because a self that never withdraws has no anchor. You would drift between roles without ever fully inhabiting any of them, adapting endlessly without arriving anywhere internally. Even rest would feel performative, something done visibly, briefly, and correctly, rather than deeply and privately. Sleep would refresh the body but not the mind, because the mind would never fully disengage from awareness of others. You would dream less vividly, think less freely, and remember less personally, because those processes depend on unguarded inner space. Over time, you would begin to feel as though your life is happening in front of you, rather than within you, like a play you attend every day, but never leave with. The sense of authorship would fade entirely. You would no longer feel that your life belongs to you in any meaningful way, only that you are responsible for maintaining it. That responsibility would feel heavy but unquestioned, because questioning requires privacy, and privacy is unavailable. The world would continue to function, and you would continue to function within it. Yet something essential would remain unresolved, an absence so normalized that it no longer feels like loss, only like reality. And that normalization is what makes the idea of lasting, without privacy, so deceptive. You might endure indefinitely, adapt perfectly, and even appear content. But endurance is not the same as living inwardly. A modern person depends on privacy, not just to hide, but to integrate, to make sense of experience, to grow quietly before stepping forward changed. Without that space, life becomes a loop rather than a path, repetition rather than progression, and in that loop, the modern self does not shatter or collapse. It simply thins until it is no longer recognizable, leaving behind a presence that survives, participates, and belongs, but never truly lives from the inside out. And even as that thinning reaches its quiet conclusion, there would still be one last unsettling layer to confront, the realization that you are no longer aware of what you are missing, only that something feels perpetually out of reach. The absence of privacy would have erased not just the inner room itself, but the memory of ever having one. You would move through life without longing for solitude, not because you are fulfilled, but because longing requires comparison, and comparison requires memory. Without a remembered contrast, the lack becomes invisible. You would feel complete in the way a sealed vessel feels complete, holding exactly what it was designed to hold and nothing more. Conversations would flow easily, routines would feel grounding, and shared rituals would provide comfort. Yet none of it would touch anything deep inside you, because depth has nowhere to collect. You would notice that your inner silence is no longer peaceful but vacant, an emptiness mistaken for calm. Thoughts would arise only when prompted, emotions only when required, reflection only when it serves a function. The inner life would operate on demand rather than curiosity. Even moments of crisis would feel strangely external, managed collectively and resolved publicly, leaving little residue behind. You would endure hardship without processing it, joy without savoring it, loss without integrating it, because integration requires time alone with feeling. Over time, life would begin to feel interchangeable, as though one day could be swapped for another, without much difference. Without privacy, uniqueness fades not just between people, but within yourself. You would feel less like a singular consciousness moving through time, and more like a node, in a continuous flow, replaceable, functional, and stable. That stability would be praised as virtue, as faithfulness, as strength, and in many ways it would be. But it would come at the cost of inner authorship. You would not feel that your life is wrong, only that it is closed, finished before it fully opens. The modern impulse to disappear for a while, to sit quietly and ask who you are becoming, would feel incomprehensible, even frightening, like stepping outside the world itself. And in that fear, you would see the final truth clearly. Privacy is not about isolation, secrecy, or selfishness. It is about giving the self a place to exist when no one else is asking anything of it. Remove that place, and the self survives only as function, not as experience. The medieval world could sustain that trade because it never promised inward fulfillment. The modern mind, however, is built around it, and so, even if you lived long, worked hard, and belonged fully, you would never truly last, because the quiet inner continuity that makes a life feel lived would have nowhere left to breathe. And beyond that final realization, life would continue in a way that feels strangely smooth, almost too smooth, like a river that no longer meets any resistance. You would flow where you are directed, carried by customs, routines, and expectations that require no inner agreement to function. Without privacy, friction disappears, and with it disappears the pressure that once shaped identity. You would stop bumping into yourself, stop encountering moments that force reflection or re-evaluation, because those encounters require stillness and distance. Instead, you would glide from task to task, interaction to interaction, feeling competent but increasingly hollow. The idea of retreating inward would feel not only unfamiliar but unnecessary, as if inner life were an outdated tool no longer suited to the world you inhabit. You would measure a good day by how little disturbance it caused, how few questions it raised, how seamlessly it fit into the collective rhythm. Disturbance would feel dangerous, not because it harms you directly, but because it interrupts the shared flow that keeps everything predictable. Over time, predictability would feel like peace. You would begin to associate comfort with sameness, and stability with silence of dissent. In such a state, the mind becomes conservative by necessity, protecting order rather than seeking truth. You would still think, but your thinking would orbit around maintenance rather than meaning. Even when something inside you stirs faintly, a flicker of curiosity, a trace of dissatisfaction, it would dissolve quickly. And still, even at that final thinning of the inner life, the world around you would insist that everything is as it should be. The rhythms of medieval life would continue uninterrupted, steady and unquestioned, giving no external signal that anything has been lost. People would laugh, argue, pray, celebrate, and mourn together, and from the outside it would look full, even rich. Yet inside you, the sense of personal continuity would keep weakening, because continuity requires private memory, private interpretation, private meaning. Without privacy, life becomes a sequence of shared moments rather than a personal journey. You would stop feeling like the author of your own story, and start feeling like a character written by circumstance and expectation. Even reflection would feel foreign, as if turning inward is an unnecessary detour rather than a source of insight. The modern habit of asking, "Why did this affect me?" or "What does this mean for me?" would feel indulgent, even pointless, because meaning is already assigned collectively. Over time, this would create a strange emotional flatness, not numbness exactly, but a lack of resonance. Experiences would happen to you, but they would not echo inside you. Nothing would sink in deeply enough to transform you. You would grow skilled at endurance, but unfamiliar with renewal. Rest would exist only as physical recovery, never as mental or emotional restoration. Without privacy, the mind is never truly off duty. It is always alert, always adjusting, always ready to be seen. That vigilance would become so normal that you would forget what mental rest ever felt like. And without mental rest, insight dries up, creativity fades, and inner direction dissolves. You would move through life guided by habit rather than intention, correctness rather than conviction. Eventually, even the idea that life could feel different would seem abstract, almost fictional. You would not rebel against the absence of privacy, because rebellion requires a private space to imagine another way of being. Instead, you would adapt so thoroughly that the lack itself disappears from awareness, and that adaptation is the final proof of incompatibility. The medieval world could sustain itself without privacy, because it never asked individuals to find themselves. It asked them to belong, to endure, to continue. The modern person, however, is shaped by the expectation that life includes an inner journey, one that unfolds quietly, invisibly, and unevenly. Remove the conditions for that journey, and the modern self does not collapse dramatically. It simply never fully arrives. Life continues, bodies persist, society functions, but the inward depth that makes existence feel personally lived fades into something thinner, flatter, and permanently unfinished. And even within that permanently unfinished state, you would sense a strange contradiction. You are always surrounded, yet profoundly unaccompanied by yourself. The crowd never leaves, the voices never stop, the expectations never soften, and because of that, there is no echo chamber inside you where thoughts can bounce freely and return transformed. Everything you experience is immediately absorbed outward, leaving nothing to settle inward. You would begin to live as though life is something happening fait-to-fait you, rather than something unfolding fate through fait you. Without privacy, the boundary between experience and interpretation collapses, and when that boundary disappears, meaning becomes thin and borrowed. You would start to feel that your reactions are rehearsed before they occur, shaped by habit rather than understanding. Even moments that should feel spontaneous would arrive pre-filtered, already constrained by what is acceptable, visible, and safe. Over time, you would lose the sensation of inner surprise, the quiet moment when a thought startles you because it reveals something unexpected about yourself. That kind of surprise requires solitude, and solitude is never secure. You would notice that your inner world no longer expands, it merely rearranges familiar elements. Nothing new takes root, because growth requires protection, and protection requires invisibility. The medieval world does not grant invisibility. It replaces it with belonging, and belonging, while stabilizing, demands constant legibility. You must be readable, interpretable, and consistent at all times. In such a world, ambiguity becomes dangerous, and ambiguity is where self-discovery lives. Slowly, you would begin to fear your own complexity, not consciously, but instinctively, because complexity attracts attention, and attention threatens stability. You would learn to smooth yourself down, to become easier to understand, easier to manage, easier to place. That ease would be rewarded, reinforced, and eventually mistaken for peace. But peace without inner freedom feels hollow, even if it never screams for attention. You would grow accustomed to that hollowness, just as you grow accustomed to noise, until you no longer notice it as absence, only as background. And yet, something in you would still sense that life is meant to have depth, meant to contain quiet chambers where thoughts can wander unobserved and emotions can untangle without judgment. That sense would never fully disappear, but it would remain vague, unarticulated, like a half-remembered dream. Without privacy, you cannot chase that dream, cannot examine it, cannot even name it clearly. It simply lingers as a faint dissatisfaction beneath everything you do. This is why the question of lasting without privacy is not about endurance, strength, or adaptation. It is about compatibility. The modern self is built on the assumption that there is an inner room no one else enters, a place where identity is shaped slowly, privately, and imperfectly. Remove that room, and the structure of the self has nowhere to stand. Life continues, society functions, routines repeat. But the inward dimension that makes existence feel owned, chosen, and deeply lived never fully survives. And as that inward dimension continues to thin, you would begin to experience a peculiar loss of orientation, as if your inner compass has been removed and replaced by external markers alone. Direction would come from bells, customs, commands, and expectations, not from any private sense of purpose. You would move when told to move, stop when told to stop, feel what is appropriate to feel, and suppress what has no place to go. Over time, you would stop noticing this substitution because it works well enough to keep life running. Yet something essential would be missing, the feeling that your actions originate from within you. Without privacy, intention becomes collective, and motivation becomes borrowed. You would carry out duties competently, even earnestly, but with a quiet detachment, as though watching yourself perform a role you did not write. That detachment would not feel like rebellion or despair. It would feel like neutrality, a flattening of emotional contrast that makes days pass smoothly but meaninglessly. You would no longer feel deeply lost or deeply found, because both states require inner exploration. Instead, you would feel perpetually adequate. Adequate is the emotional baseline of a life without privacy. It is stable, functional, and unremarkable, offering no sharp pain, but also no profound fulfillment. You would notice that your inner questions have faded, not because they were answered, but because there was never a place to keep asking them. Curiosity would feel impractical, introspection unnecessary, and self-understanding optional at best. Over time, you would forget that the mind can be a place to inhabit, rather than merely a tool to respond. Thought would become utilitarian, focused on immediate needs, social alignment and survival. Reflection without outcome would feel wasteful. Silence without purpose would feel uncomfortable. The modern practice of sitting alone with no agenda, simply existing, would feel almost frightening, like stepping outside the bounds of reality. And in that fear, you would see the final shape of a world without privacy, a world that does not crush the self violently, but dissolves it gently through constant use, constant exposure, constant togetherness. You would be everywhere, with everyone, at all times, yet never fully with yourself, and that is the quiet. enduring reason you would not last. Not because the body fails, but because the inward life that gives the body direction, coherence, and meaning has nowhere left to live. And even after that inward life has thinned to almost nothing, the world would still demand your full participation, as if presence alone were proof of wholeness. You would speak, nod, agree, and comply, feeling increasingly fluent in the language of expectation, while forgetting the language of inner truth. The act of appearing correct would slowly replace the desire to feel real. You would grow comfortable being interpreted, defined, and understood by others, because defining yourself privately would feel like an unnecessary effort with no safe place to land. Over time, you would stop distinguishing between who you are and how you are perceived, until the two collapse into a single, flattened identity. This collapse would not feel dramatic, it would feel efficient. Efficiency would become the highest virtue, because efficiency keeps life moving when reflection is unavailable. You would become good at living without friction, smoothing away impulses that do not serve immediate function. Yet friction is where insight is born, and without it, consciousness becomes shallow and repetitive. You would feel as though you are living the same day repeatedly, even as seasons change and years pass. The absence of privacy would erase the sense of inner progression, leaving only external milestones to mark time. You would age, but not deepen. You would change roles, but not perspective. And even within that stable emptiness, there would remain a faint, persistent tension. The sense that something essential has been misplaced, but not lost loudly enough to be mourned. You would move through life with competence and familiarity, yet feel as though you are always slightly misaligned with it, like a garment tailored for someone else that you have learnt to wear. Without privacy, there would be no private reckoning, no quiet confrontation with dissatisfaction, so the tension would never resolve into action or understanding. It would simply become background noise, a low hum beneath daily life. You would grow accustomed to it, just as you would grow accustomed to being watched, evaluated, and interpreted. Over time, that hum would feel inseparable from existence itself, making it difficult to imagine that life could ever feel otherwise. You would stop missing privacy consciously, because longing requires memory, and memory fades when it cannot be revisited alone. Instead, you would experience a generalized dullness, a sense that life is happening correctly, but not deeply. Moments of intensity would still occur. Fear during crisis, joy during celebration, sorrow during loss, but they would crest and fall quickly, never sinking inward to transform you. Without privacy, experiences remain events rather than lessons. They pass through the body but fail to settle in the mind. You would begin to feel as though your inner landscape is unfinished, not because it lacks content, but because it lacks silence. Silence is where meaning condenses, where emotions rearrange themselves into understanding. In its absence, everything remains slightly unresolved, yet paradoxically closed to exploration. You would live in a state of perpetual partiality, never fully confused, never fully clear. Even self-awareness would feel shallow, because awareness without privacy turns outward, tracking how you appear rather than how you are. You would know yourself primarily through feedback, not through reflection. Praise would shape you more than truth, and disapproval would wound more than failure. Over time, this would teach you to prioritize smoothness over sincerity, acceptability over authenticity. The modern idea that a person can grow inwardly, unseen, before changing outwardly would feel unrealistic, even irresponsible. Change would be expected to be visible immediately or not at all. And so, the inner life would remain stunted, not from repression alone, but from neglect. There would simply be no place to tend it. In that world, the self is something you present, not something you inhabit. And that final distinction explains everything. Without privacy, life becomes continuous presence without interior depth, a steady performance without rehearsal or rest. You may endure it, adapt to it, even function well within it, but the version of you that requires quiet, invisibility, and inner freedom to exist would never truly survive. And even after that realization settles in, life would continue to press forward with an almost deceptive normality, which might be the most unsettling part of all. Nothing would feel obviously broken, yet nothing would feel fully alive either. You would wake, work, speak, listen, eat, pray, and sleep, moving through the rhythm of days that feel complete on the surface, but strangely unfinished underneath. Without privacy, there is no true pause between moments, no internal punctuation where experience can turn into understanding. Everything flows directly into the next obligation, the next interaction, the next expectation. You would begin to sense that your inner world is always slightly lagging behind your outer life, never given the chance to catch up. Thoughts would arrive late, emotions would surface after they are already socially resolved, and insight would feel like a luxury you no longer remember how to access. You would grow accustomed to this delay until reflection itself feels unnecessary, even burdensome. Why look inward when the world already tells you who you are, what you should feel, and how you should respond? Over time, you would internalize that logic, trusting external order more than internal clarity. The idea that truth might emerge quietly, privately, and slowly would begin to feel implausible. Instead, truth would be something announced, agreed upon, and reinforced publicly. In such a world, certainty replaces curiosity, and stability replaces exploration. You would feel safe, but that safety would come at the cost of depth. You would belong, but belonging would require constant visibility. You would be known, but only in ways that are legible to others, never in the ways that feel most fragile or personal. Even your inner contradictions would remain unresolved, because resolving them requires solitude, and solitude is never fully allowed. They would simply be smoothed over by routine and expectation, leaving you functional but internally unresolved. And that unresolved state would slowly become permanent, not because you choose it, but because there is no space for anything else to form. This is the quiet end point of a life without privacy, not suffering, not rebellion, not collapse, but a smooth, continuous existence where the inner self is never fully invited to participate. And for a modern person, shaped by the belief that life should be lived from the inside as much as from the outside, that absence would be unbearable, even if it never announces itself as pain. And beneath that smooth continuity, a deeper disorientation would take hold because you would slowly lose the ability to tell where obligation ends and desire begins. In a world without privacy, wanting something quietly, without justification or permission, becomes almost impossible. Desire must either be expressed openly or suppressed entirely, leaving no neutral space where it can exist safely as a feeling. Over time, you would stop trusting your wants, assuming they are either inappropriate or irrelevant unless validated by others. This would make choice itself feel hollow, because choices made without inner conviction feel more like compliance than agency. You would act correctly without feeling aligned, move forward without feeling directed. Even moments of success would feel oddly distant, because achievement without private satisfaction feels incomplete, like applause heard through a wall. You would begin to understand that privacy is where motivation is born, where purpose takes shape before it is shared. Without it, life becomes reactive, guided by circumstance rather than intention. You would grow highly capable at managing appearances, maintaining harmony, and avoiding conflict, yet strangely incapable of answering the simplest inward questions. What do I want? What matters to me? Who am I becoming? These questions would feel abstract, even unnecessary, because nothing in your environment encourages them. Instead, you would be rewarded for fitting, not for discovering. The world would feel full, noisy, and communal, yet internally sparse, like a room crowded with people but lacking air. You would sense that you are always arriving somewhere, but never arriving at yourself, and that is the quiet, cumulative cost of a life without privacy. It removes the conditions required for self-recognition. You can be known by everyone and still never truly know yourself. Over time, that absence of self-knowledge would not feel tragic, it would feel normal, and that normalization would be the final transformation. The point at which the modern mind, built on the expectation of inner space, finally gives up trying to exist as it once did. Life would continue, structured, meaningful to the collective, stable in its own logic. But the part of you that needs to disappear sometimes in order to understand itself would have nowhere to go, and without that disappearing, that quiet inward retreat, the modern self does not break. It simply never fully forms. And even as that self never fully forms, you would feel a faint lingering sense of incompletion that never quite sharpens into awareness. It would sit beneath your thoughts like an unanswered question you have forgotten how to ask. You would sense that life is happening continuously, efficiently, and correctly, yet something essential never quite arrives. Without privacy, anticipation loses its depth, because imagining a future requires quiet space to let possibilities expand without correction. Instead, the future would appear already shaped, already approved, already folded neatly into expectation. You would move toward it not with excitement or dread, but with resignation disguised as acceptance. Over time, you would stop distinguishing between what you endure and what you choose, because both would feel the same in the absence of inner reference points. Even moments of apparent freedom would feel strangely scripted, because freedom without privacy still unfolds under observation. You would begin to understand that true freedom is not loud or dramatic, but silent, internal, and often invisible, and that invisibility is precisely what medieval life denies. The constant presence of others would train you to externalize meaning, to locate value in recognition rather than resonance. You would feel real only when acknowledged, useful only when witnessed, valid only when affirmed. Alone even briefly, you would feel unsteady, as if existence itself requires an audience. This dependence would not feel like weakness. It would feel normal, even virtuous, because the culture would reinforce it daily. Yet beneath that normality, the modern instinct for inner grounding would quietly starve. You would miss the ability to sit with uncertainty, to let confusion stretch into insight, to hold contradictions without resolving them immediately. Those processes require privacy not as luxury, but as condition. Without them, understanding remains shallow, conclusions remain inherited, and as that mechanical survival continues, you would begin to understand how deeply privacy shapes not just comfort, but consciousness itself. Without moments of invisibility, awareness turns outward permanently, scanning faces, reactions, and expectations, until the mind forgets how to rest inside itself. You would lose the sense that thoughts can exist without purpose, that feelings can simply be felt rather than managed. Everything internal would need a reason, a justification, a visible outcome, because nothing is allowed to remain unexpressed or unresolved in public life. The constant need to respond would slowly replace the ability to reflect. You would find yourself speaking before thinking, agreeing before understanding, moving before deciding, because hesitation attracts attention, and attention carries risk. Over time, this would erode not only individuality but depth, leaving behind a version of you that is efficient, adaptive, and emotionally guarded. You would become very good at reading others and very bad at reading yourself. In the absence of privacy, self-knowledge becomes secondary to social awareness. The medieval world depended on this trade, because cohesion mattered more than inner freedom, and predictability mattered more than personal truth. But for a modern person, trained from childhood to believe that thoughts matter even when unspoken, that feelings are valid even when hidden, this inversion would feel profoundly disorienting. You would sense a quiet grief for something you can no longer access, a subtle mourning for an inner life that once felt rich and expansive. That grief would be difficult to name, because naming it would require private language, and private language cannot survive long without private space. Eventually, you would stop trying to articulate it and accept the dull ache as normal. That acceptance would not feel like peace. It would feel like resignation dressed up as stability. And in that final adaptation, the last trace of the modern self would disappear. Not through violence or suffering, but through constant exposure that leaves nothing untouched long enough to grow. In a world where nothing is hidden, nothing becomes sacred, and without something sacred inside, survival loses its meaning. And even after that acceptance settles in, the erosion keeps working quietly beneath the surface, because a life without privacy never truly stabilizes. It only maintains itself through constant motion. You would feel an unspoken pressure to remain visible, useful, and responsive at all times, as if existence itself requires proof through action. Stillness would feel suspicious, reflection indulgent, withdrawal unacceptable. You would begin to confuse presence with purpose, believing that as long as you are seen participating, you are living correctly. Over time, this would strip life of contrast, because contrast requires pauses, and pauses require privacy. Without those pauses, days blur together into a continuous present, where nothing fully begins and nothing truly ends. You would stop anticipating the future in personal terms, because anticipation grows in quiet spaces where imagination can roam without correction. Instead, you would think in cycles, seasons, duties, and expectations, repeating patterns that feel safe precisely because they are known. The mind would grow smaller, not from lack of intelligence, but from lack of room. You would notice how difficult it becomes to hold complex emotions at once, because complexity needs time alone to untangle itself. Without that time, emotions simplify into acceptable categories, manageable reactions, socially legible responses. You would feel less conflicted, but not because you are at peace, because conflict has nowhere to exist privately. Even suffering would feel strangely impersonal, shared and normalized, leaving little space to ask what it means to you. And in that normalization, pain loses its capacity to teach, becoming something to endure rather than understand. The absence of privacy would quietly sever the link between experience and insight. You would live through events without extracting personal meaning from them, because meaning is forged in solitude. Over time, this would make life feel strangely distant, as though you are always participating but rarely inhabiting your own existence. You would sense that something essential is missing, but without privacy, you would lack the language, patience and safety to explore that feeling. It would remain an unnamed absence, a faint pressure behind the eyes, a tiredness that sleep never resolves. And that is the final cruelty of a world without privacy. It does not break you loudly, or obviously, it simply prevents you from becoming fully yourself, leaving you alive, visible and functioning, yet quietly hollowed out from the inside. And even that quiet hollowness would not announce itself clearly, because a world without privacy teaches you to distrust inner signals. You would begin to doubt the legitimacy of your own discomfort, wondering whether the sense of loss you feel is real or merely indulgent. In a society where inner life is never centered, any attention turned inward feels excessive. You would learn to dismiss subtle dissatisfaction as weakness, and to replace it with busyness, ritual, and outward compliance. Over time, this habit would harden into worldview that meaning comes from participation, not reflection, from belonging, not understanding, from being seen, not from seeing yourself. You would grow skilled at fulfilling roles and less capable of inhabiting them. Even moments that should feel personal achievement, failure, love, regret, would arrive already interpreted by others, leaving you with little authority over what they signify. The self would become an echo rather than a source responding to the world instead of generating from within. You would notice how quickly emotions must move in such a world, how nothing is allowed to linger quietly because lingering invites scrutiny. Feelings would either be expressed publicly or pushed aside entirely, leaving no middle space where they could unfold privately and mature. That middle space is where modern people process grief, refine desire, and reconcile contradiction, and without it, emotional life becomes shallow but intense, reactive rather than reflective. You would feel things strongly in the moment and then move on quickly, not because they are resolved, but because unresolved feelings have nowhere to live. This constant forward motion would feel like progress from the outside, but internally it would feel like being carried by a current you did not choose. You would stop asking whether your life fits you and start asking whether you fit your life, and in that inversion, autonomy quietly dissolves. The medieval world could function this way because it did not promise inner fulfillment. It promised order, continuity, and survival. But a modern person, raised to believe that a life should be personally meaningful, would feel a constant, aching mismatch. That mismatch would never explode into open rebellion, because rebellion requires privacy to plan and imagine. Instead, it would settle into a low, persistent unease, a sense of being perpetually unfinished, yet unable to change. You would exist entirely in relation to others, never in relation to yourself, until the very idea of a self apart from role feels foreign. And at that point, lasting becomes a misleading word, because while days continue and routines hold, the inward journey that defines modern humanity is nowhere to go. Without privacy, life does not end, but it stops deepening. It repeats, it persists, it endures, but it no longer grows. And when growth stops, something subtler replaces it, a kind of emotional fossilization, where habits harden and inner movement slows to a near standstill. You would feel yourself becoming easier to predict, even to yourself, because unpredictability requires inner experimentation, and experimentation needs privacy. Without it, you would rely on familiar reactions, familiar thoughts, familiar responses, repeating them not because they are true, but because they are safe. The self would become less a living process and more a fixed shape, defined early and reinforced endlessly. Curiosity would dull, not from lack of intelligence, but from lack of protected space to wander without consequence. You would stop wondering what else you could be, because wondering itself feels pointless when there is nowhere to explore it quietly. Over time, you would feel strangely old, regardless of age, carrying a sense of completion that is not fulfillment but closure imposed from the outside. Life would feel decided long before it is finished. Even surprise would lose its depth, because surprise without privacy cannot turn inward into reflection. It must immediately become reaction. You would respond, adapt, and move on, never fully absorbing what happened. This would make existence feel thinner, as though experiences pass through you rather than settle within you. The modern habit of sitting with discomfort, of letting confusion exist long enough to teach something, would be impossible. Confusion would be corrected quickly by others, or suppressed internally to avoid attention. In that environment, wisdom does not emerge from contemplation. It is inherited, repeated, and enforced. You would begin to feel that your life belongs more to the system than to you, not in a dramatic sense of oppression, but in a quiet, unquestioned way. Decisions would feel less like choices, and more like acknowledgements of what is already expected. Even when you agree, the agreement would feel empty, because consent without the option of private dissent is not fully yours. Over time, you would lose the sensation of inner momentum, the feeling that your life is moving somewhere meaningful from the inside out. Instead, movement would be external, and still, the consequences would keep unfolding, because a life without privacy does not merely limit you in the present. It reaches backward and forward in time, altering how you understand your past and imagine your future. Without a private inner space, reflection becomes shallow, because every attempt to look inward is interrupted by obligation, noise, or expectation. You would lose the ability to reinterpret your experiences on your own terms, since meaning would always be negotiated publicly, shaped by tradition and authority rather than personal insight. Regret would linger longer because there would be no quiet place to process it, no safe mental room where mistakes could be examined without judgment. Likewise, hope would feel fragile and risky, because imagining a different future without permission could be mistaken for dissatisfaction with the present, which itself could invite correction or punishment. Over time, you would stop dreaming expansively, not because life had beaten you down dramatically, but because dreaming without privacy feels irresponsible when survival depends on blending in. Your sense of time would also narrow, focused almost entirely on the immediate cycle of duties, rituals, and seasons. because long-term personal vision requires solitude to form. In this way, medieval life without privacy compresses existence into repetition, where days differ only slightly and individuality dissolves into habit. You would notice how people around you seem anchored, even resigned, not because they lack intelligence or feeling, but because their world offers no protected space to imagine alternatives. The constant presence of others would make every emotional fluctuation feel amplified, leaving you hyper, aware of how you are perceived, and slowly detached from how you actually feel. Even silence, when it occurred, would feel heavy rather than peaceful, because it would never truly belong to you alone. There would always be the sense that silence was temporary borrowed, about to be interrupted. And in that anticipation, the mind would never fully settle. You would live in a state of low-level alertness, always ready to respond, explain, or adjust, and that vigilance would drain you in ways physical labor never could. What modern people call burnout would arrive not from work alone, but from the impossibility of psychological rest. Eventually, you would realize that privacy is the only place where exhaustion can safely land, where the mind can loosen its grip and exist without purpose. Without it, fatigue becomes permanent, woven into the fabric of consciousness. You might continue to function, to smile, to obey, but inside there would be a quiet numbness, a thinning of emotional depth that makes life feel distant even as it surrounds you. This is why the idea of lasting without privacy is misleading, because endurance measured only by breath and heartbeat misses the deeper cost. Survival without privacy is survival without interiority, without the invisible room where a person becomes more than their role. In the medieval world, that trade-off made sense, because collective stability mattered more than individual fulfillment. But for a modern person shaped by the expectation of inner freedom, that trade-off would feel like a kind of living erasure, and so the final realization would not come as panic or despair, but as a quiet, unsettling clarity. Without privacy, you would still be alive, still moving, still seen by everyone. Yet you would no longer be fully present within yourself, and that, more than any hardship or danger, is why you truly would not last. And even beyond that point, the damage would continue in subtler, almost invisible ways, because a life without privacy does not end in collapse. It fades into something thinner and quieter. You would notice how language itself begins to change inside you, how words lose precision, because speaking honestly requires safety, and safety requires concealment. Without a private space to test thoughts, your inner vocabulary would shrink, favoring familiar phrases and approved expressions over personal nuance. You would start to think in borrowed sentences, inherited beliefs, and communal assumptions, because originality feels dangerous when it must immediately face exposure. Over time, your emotional reactions would arrive already filtered, already shaped to fit expectation, until it becomes difficult to tell where feeling ends and performance begins. Even memory would soften at the edges, because moments that are never yours alone are harder to hold on to with clarity. Experiences would feel less owned, less intimate, as if they belong to the group more than to you. You would struggle to form a sense of personal narrative, because your story would always be told alongside others, corrected, reframed, and absorbed into collective history. In such a world, identity does not unfold inwardly. It is assigned outwardly, reinforced daily through repetition. you would come to understand that privacy is the soil where complexity grows, where contradictions can coexist long enough to become wisdom. Without that soil, life becomes simpler, but poorer, safer but flatter. You would still laugh, still work, still pray, but each of those actions would feel slightly hollow, stripped of the quiet resonance that comes from choosing them freely. The absence of privacy would not feel dramatic in any single moment. Instead, it would feel like a constant low hum, a background pressure that never lifts, never allows the mind to fully relax. And in that pressure, the modern sense of self, built on introspection, autonomy, and inner dialogue, would gradually lose coherence. You would not notice the exact moment it disappears, only the absence it leaves behind. What remains would be functional, compliant, and visible, but no longer deeply yours. And that is the final, inescapable truth. Without privacy, life continues, society functions, and people endure. But the inner freedom that defines modern humanity cannot survive. In a medieval world where nothing is hidden, and nothing belongs solely to you, lasting is not about strength or resilience. It is about surrendering the very idea of an inner life. And for someone shaped by a world that promises personal space, silent thought, and unseen moments, that surrender would be the point at which lasting becomes impossible. And still the pressure would not lift, because a world without privacy reshapes not only how you think and feel, but how you understand existence itself. You would begin to sense that your life is always slightly ahead of you, already interpreted, already categorized, already absorbed into a shared story that leaves little room for personal meaning. Moments that should feel intimate, a quiet realization, a sudden fear, a fragile joy, would arrive already crowded, already owned by expectation. You would stop asking yourself who you are becoming, because becoming implies change, and change attracts attention. Stability would feel safer than growth, even when stability feels empty. Over time, you would internalize the belief that wanting more inner space is selfish, that needing silence is weakness, that desiring invisibility is suspicious. Those beliefs would not feel imposed. They would feel natural, because the environment would reward their acceptance daily. You would watch others live this way and feel both comforted and trapped by their familiarity, sensing that everyone is enduring the same quiet narrowing, yet no one has the language to name it. Without privacy, language for inner struggle never fully develops. Pain is expressed only when it becomes visible enough to demand response. And even then, it is quickly folded back into ritual and explanation. You would learn to tolerate discomfort rather than understand it, because understanding requires time alone with thought. Your sense of self would become reactive rather than reflective, shaped by what happens to you rather than by how you process it. Even faith, which might seem like a refuge, would offer little privacy, because belief is practiced publicly, monitored for correctness, and reinforced collectively. Doubt would have nowhere to hide, and without a hidden place, it would either harden into silence or be crushed outright. In such conditions, inner honesty becomes rare, not because people are dishonest, but because honesty requires protection. You would slowly realize that what modern people call authenticity is impossible, without some degree of invisibility. To be authentic, you must be allowed to be uncertain, contradictory, and unfinished without consequence. Medieval life did not allow that luxury, because it could not afford it. Survival demanded clarity, hierarchy, and shared meaning, even at the cost of personal depth. And so, as the days stretch on, you would feel yourself becoming easier to read and harder to know, both to others and to yourself. The inner voice that once commented, questioned, and wondered would grow quieter, not silenced by force, but crowded out by constant presence. You would still exist, still function, still belong, but belonging would come at the cost of interior freedom, and in that realization the final weight of it all would settle. A modern person does not collapse in a medieval world because they lack strength, but because they rely on privacy as a form of oxygen. Remove it, and the body may continue to move, but the mind slowly suffocates, adapting just enough to survive while losing the space that made survival meaningful in the first place. And beyond even that suffocation, there would emerge a quiet strangeness in how reality feels, as though life itself has lost depth and become strangely flat. You would notice that moments no longer linger after they pass, because lingering requires a private inner echo, a space where experiences can reverberate and settle. Without privacy, everything happens once, number zero. If the days continued to blur together, you would notice something even more unsettling. You would begin to forget what privacy ever felt like, and that forgetting would scare you more than the exposure itself. The mind adapts quickly when it has no alternative, and in medieval life adaptation meant surrender. You would stop expecting secrecy, stop craving silence, stop imagining a version of yourself that existed outside the gaze of others. Your inner world would shrink, not because you chose it to, but because maintaining it required energy you no longer had. Thoughts would become simpler, safer, shaped for survival rather than truth. You would measure yourself constantly through other people's reactions until approval replaced authenticity as the primary goal. This was not brainwashing in a dramatic sense, but erosion slow and invisible, the kind that leaves no clear moment of collapse. Without privacy, memory itself would feel crowded, because every experience was shared, retold, and reinterpreted by others, until your own version of events no longer felt authoritative. Even resistance would fade, because pushing back required a private space to imagine alternatives, and that space did not exist. What remained was endurance, a life lived outwardly, defined by ritual, repetition, and expectation. From the outside, you might appear functional, even normal, but internally the modern self would be gone, replaced by a quieter, narrower consciousness designed to fit the collective mold. That is the deepest reason survival becomes impossible to measure by physical endurance alone. You might breathe, work, eat, and sleep, but the person you recognize as you would not be there anymore. And in that sense, you truly would not last, because without privacy, the modern idea of a self does not die loudly or dramatically. It simply dissolves, unnoticed, into a world that never made room for it in the first place. As that dissolution deepened, you would start to sense how medieval life quietly discouraged any form of inner rebellion before it could even take shape. Without privacy, rebellion had no soil to grow in. You could not sit alone and rehearse a different future, could not privately weigh beliefs against doubt, could not safely imagine a life beyond the one assigned to you. Every idea had to survive immediate exposure, and most fragile thoughts died the moment they were overheard, laughed at, corrected, or condemned. Over time, curiosity itself would feel dangerous, because questions attracted attention, and attention invited judgment. You would learn to accept explanations rather than seek them, not because they satisfied you, but because the cost of questioning was too high. Even imagination would become communal, shaped by sermons, stories, and shared fears, leaving little room for personal meaning. The night sky, instead of inspiring wonder, would be read collectively as prophecy or warning, stripping it of private interpretation. You would feel constantly emotionally available to others, expected to respond, react, and participate. With no right to withdraw, fatigue would not excuse silence, illness would not excuse absence, sadness would not excuse detachment. In a world without privacy, rest itself became a public act that required permission. You would realize that the modern habit of stepping back, taking a break, or saying, "I need time," would sound incomprehensible, even offensive, to medieval ears. Time belonged to the community just as much as your body did, and so the exhaustion would not come from labor alone, but from never being off stage, from never being allowed to simply exist without purpose. The self would be worn down, not by punishment, but by constant use. Eventually, you would no longer feel wronged by this exposure. You would feel empty without it, uneasy in moments of quiet, anxious when not observed. That final transformation would be the most unsettling of all, because it would mean the modern self, once built on boundaries and inner space, had fully adapted to a world that never acknowledged its need to exist. And even then, the erosion would not stop, because a life without privacy does not reach a stable endpoint. It keeps narrowing. You would begin to feel uneasy during rare moments when no one was directly watching you, as if something were missing, as if existence itself required witnesses to feel real. Your sense of worth would become entirely external, dependent on visible usefulness, obedience, and conformity, because there was no private space where value could exist independently of approval. Failure would feel catastrophic, not because of personal disappointment, but because it instantly became public knowledge, etched into communal memory. There would be no quiet recovery, no invisible rebuilding, only a permanent mark that followed you through every interaction. Forgiveness, when it came, would also be public, conditional, and never complete. You would learn to fear standing out more than being unhappy, because standing out meant exposure without protection. Over time, your emotional range would flatten, not from peace, but from self-preservation, as strong feelings attracted attention and attention carried risk. You would notice how medieval life rewarded predictability, how routines dulled the edges of individuality, until people moved through days almost automatically, guided by bells, customs, and expectations. This was not a failure of imagination, but a strategy for survival in a world where deviation was dangerous. The modern desire to be yourself would slowly feel childish, even irresponsible, because the self you knew required solitude to exist, and solitude was never allowed. In its place would grow a quieter, more cautious version of consciousness, one that measured safety before truth and acceptance before honesty. And that is when you would finally understand that the greatest cost of living without privacy is not embarrassment or discomfort, but the gradual loss of the inner life itself. Without a hidden space to think, feel, and change, the self becomes fixed, brittle, and defined entirely by others. At that point, survival becomes hollow, because while the body endures, the inner freedom that makes endurance meaningful has already vanished. As the imagined stretch of time continues far beyond what a modern mind is built to endure, the absence of privacy would begin to feel less like an external condition, and more like a permanent reshaping of reality itself, until you could no longer separate who you are from who others believe you to be. Every choice you make would feel pre-decided by expectation, because the pressure of constant visibility teaches obedience more efficiently than force ever could. You would notice that even resistance feels pointless when there is no quiet space to strengthen it, no private rehearsal of courage, no hidden place where doubt can turn into conviction. Without privacy, thoughts do not mature. They are exposed too early, judged too quickly, and often abandoned before they become fully formed. You would stop asking yourself what you want and start asking what is allowed, what is safe, what will draw the least attention. Over time, this calculation would become automatic, replacing instinct with caution. Even memory would change shape, because when every event is shared, retold and corrected by others, your personal version of the past loses authority, leaving you unsure whether your feelings are valid or merely inconvenient. You would feel watched even when alone, because the gaze of the community would be internalized, echoing inside your thoughts like an invisible judge. This internal surveillance would be the final victory of a privacy, less world, because once it takes hold, external watchers are no longer needed. You would discipline yourself before anyone else has the chance. In such a world, creativity withers quietly, not because imagination disappears, but because risk becomes unbearable. To create something new is to invite attention, and attention without privacy is exposure without defense. You would learn to repeat rather than invent, to echo rather than question, to preserve rather than explore. Emotional honesty would become dangerous, because feelings that cannot be hidden must be justified, moderated, or suppressed. Anger would be labelled disobedience, sadness would be scrutinized for moral weakness, and joy would be tolerated only when it aligns with approved occasions. The inner life would flatten into something manageable, predictable, and small. You would realize that privacy is not simply about being unseen, but about having the freedom to be unfinished, to be confused, to be wrong in ways no one else needs to witness. Medieval life denied that freedom completely. Growth, when it happened, was slow and externally guided, shaped by tradition rather than introspection. Without privacy, there is no safe failure, and without safe failure, there is no true transformation. You would begin to envy even the smallest modern habits you once took for granted. The ability to sit quietly without explanation, to think without interruption, to feel without being observed. Those habits would feel almost sacred in retrospect. Proof of a psychological shelter. You never realized you depended on so deeply. As days blurred into routine, you would sense how identity itself becomes shallow when it is constantly displayed. A self that is always visible must always be consistent, and consistency leaves little room for contradiction, growth, or reinvention. You would become reliable but hollow, functional but constrained, present but absent from yourself. And that is when the final truth would settle in, heavy and undeniable. The modern self cannot survive without privacy, because it is built upon it. Privacy is where doubt becomes understanding, where pain becomes meaning, where desire becomes direction,